All right, welcome everybody. It is wonderful to have you with us again. We're going to get straight into it. So I'm going to start with a story that we told last week, except that the melon has shrunk to the size of a grapefruit this week. And what this is, and this is for the benefit of those who weren't with us last week, is just a little picture of what happened in the moment of the creation of humans, which is that God made the human in his image. And so we saw that the image of God included things like goodness and love and nurture and creativity and reproductivity and responsibility. And then God, in chapter 2 of Genesis, it says that he cut a side off the human, and from the side of the human he made the woman. And so he divided humanity into male and female, and thereby playing a very interesting trick on especially the man, because ever since then humans, and particularly men, have been searching for what we fondly call our other half, and in my case what I call my better half, and I'm sure that most of the men here present will agree. And so we are seeking for that one with whom we reunite. And what marriage is really, the goal of marriage is really this, that the two shall become one. And so we're approaching this entire little series with with that in mind, with the goal of marriage being the reuniting of the two halves of creation in the form of marriage. I sent you the questionnaire from a book by a man called Willard F. Harley called Men's Needs, Women's Needs. And in that book, he includes the list of these 10 needs that he had discovered in a survey of a number of couples, couple of thousand couples, in fact, of what are the needs that drive us toward marriage. I'll come back to this thing of the trick that God played on us in a moment, but what Harley found is that these 10 were the common denominators, the ones that came up 95% of the time in the survey. What do you need from marriage? And people spoke about affection, that is, physical expressions of affection. Secondly, sexual fulfillment, and by that he meant how your reality measures up to your fantasies. Thirdly, conversation, which has to do with enjoyment of conversation just because of the company of the person and the conversation with the person concerned. So it doesn't have a purpose except connection. Fourthly was recreational companionship, which I've often explained as the fact that he wants her to enjoy watching the game with him, or be his caddy when he plays golf, or whatever it may be. So it's involvement in play or in recreational life together. Fifth is honesty and openness, which includes voluntary, vulnerable, trustworthy expression of your inner feelings and thoughts. Then number 6 is an attractive spouse. And I think you can probably guess for whom that was the most important of the two genders. Financial support was another one, providing for the material well-being and survival of the family. Then number 8 was domestic support, which has to do with the fact that you're engaged in household chores together. Family commitment, being involved in the raising of the children together and in things like helping with homework, etc. And finally, admiration, being respect, value, and appreciation from the spouse concerned. And so these were the 10, and this is what happened in terms of the breakdown, and once again with a 95% consistency in terms of the difference between men and women. And so in the case of women, 95% of the time they had it not only these five, but in this kind of order, with a little bit of deviation or change here or there, but 95% correlation. Affection was number one, conversation was number two, honesty and openness was number three, financial support was number four, and family commitment was number five. In the case of men, I'm sure you can guess, sexual fulfillment was number one, recreational companionship number two, an attractive spouse was number three, domestic companionship number four, and admiration number five. And what you will notice, none of the items were common to both. Again, in the range of between 95 and 97%, there was no correlation, there was no duplication of the same need in men and women. Now, I don't remember how long ago this study was done, and I am very aware of the danger of generalizations. So what I think we need to do is to take this as a little bit of a guideline, but not to become too bound by the idea either of the fact that those are the only 10, or of the fact that there is this kind of neat segregation between men and women. But it is something of a little wake-up call about need motivation for marriage. Secondly was another book that I want to just mention, which is Gary Chapman's famous 5 Love Languages book, in which he identifies these 5 as the languages that speak to us, that say we are loved. In other words, this is speaking from the side of the person feeling the need, but also it addresses each spouse in terms of learning what your spouse's love language is and learning to speak that language. Otherwise, you could be in a situation where you could be speaking what you think is love to your spouse for your entire married life, but they're actually never getting the message because you're speaking the wrong language. And so you're a kind of accidental tourist in somebody else's country, and they don't really get you. And these are the 5 that Gary Chapman identified: words of affirmation, thoughtful gifts, acts of service, physical touch, and quality time. They're pretty self-explanatory, and I'm not going to go into detail about them. If you're interested, you can not only find the book, but you can also find numerous reviews or studies that are based on Gary Chapman's book. What I'm wanting to say from these 2 sources, from Willard F. Harley and from Gary Chapman, is that the point of both of their studies or surveys was that there is a way in which you can create or develop a happy union between the 2 of you, as long as you are aware of your needs and as long as the other person is willing to be the means of satisfying those needs, scratching where you itch, so to speak. Now, there is something a little troubling about that, because it once again speaks of the fact that at a very superficial level, in some cases, a very superficial level, we are in marriage for ourselves, for our needs to be met. And as long as those needs are being met, not only will we stay in the marriage, but we will be relatively happy in the marriage. In fact, Willard Harley's subtitle is How to Affair-Proof Your Marriage. And I suppose that, again, there is merit in saying that. But I just want to steer us a little deeper with regard to how does motivation really work. So next time we will talk about how love matures in any marriage relationship, and the fact that it is supposed to mature. It is supposed to go deeper than the way it starts out. It may start out with something very superficial, but it is supposed to go to a place where we are less self-centered and more other-centered if we are going to be married and fulfilled in our marriages in the long term. So when I studied motivation a number of years ago, obviously the first form of motivation that you identify is this one of need motivation. You're hungry, you find food, you eat the food, and the hunger or the need is met. Motivation is what we call motive for action. It is something that gives us the get up and go for the go out and do with regard to any of these things. And what everyone is needing and looking for is something that will sustainably motivate them throughout the long term within the context of their marriages. There are a couple of ways in which we do that in all kinds of areas. In business, I've seen this work in business, I've seen it work in education, I've seen it work in parenting. The use of two basic methodologies when it comes to motivation. The first one is fear motivation. It is predicated on punishment. It says to the donkey, go or you will be beaten. And so in seeking to escape from the punishment or the pain, the donkey moves forward, thus satisfying the person riding the donkey. The second kind of motivation is incentive motivation, which is predicated on reward. So instead of having a whip in his hand, the man shortens the stick, hangs a carrot on the end of it, and dangles the carrot in front of the donkey. And so the donkey, seeking to get hold of the carrot, moves forward. And as long as the carrot is juicy enough and the donkey really believes that he has a chance of catching it, he will keep moving forward. So incentive motivation is based on reward. What is wrong with both of these is that they're only effective for a short period of time. While the reward is big enough or the pain is bad enough, they will continue to be motivated by both of these methods. But there comes a point at which the person goes, enough of this, I'm not doing this anymore, you can beat me as much as you like. Or where the person says, nah, I've had enough carrots, and in fact this carrot is kind of running out of juice. And so we come to a third form of motivation, which is the one that appeals to the more noble aspirations in human beings. It's what we call attitude motivation. It's something that we discover within us, like this particular donkey finding the motivation of love, and perhaps in his case the desire to leave a legacy, to reproduce. So this is not an exact parallel to many other things, but what I want us to just focus on for a moment is the fact that what we need to discover for sustainable motivation that comes from the inside out rather than the outside in is that we need to discover the noble cause. We need to discover a reason why that is strong enough. We need to discover a want to that is not superficial, but that actually goes toward our ultimate destiny, our ultimate well-being, and not only ours, but the well-being of others that we may in some way be connected to. And so what this is really telling us, coming back to our model of marriage being a place where we sow seeds, is that I want us to understand that part of our responsibility in marriage is to together be sowing the seeds of visioning. Seeds of vision about myself and who I want to become. Seeds of the vision of marriage and what I want that to become. Seeds of vision about my long-term future, our long-term future as a couple and as a family. There's a wonderful biblical picture of this in Psalm 37, which talks about starting from the perspective of desire or of vision, that says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And out of that will come a way or a path. And then he says, design your way and then commit that way to the Lord, and he will bring it to pass. And so that just by way of background about motivation. Now I want us to move on to the subject of how our brain works. The fact is that we do have a brain, and the brain is not the same as the mind, but the brain shapes the mind. The brain forms the mind. And the mind is that mechanism, that piece of software that sits within the hardware of the brain and with which we do business with the world. Now, I have a couple of sayings that I've put on the notes that say, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that expression. In the Proverbs it says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Or to put it in the form that psychologists use it, you do not act like the person you are, but like the person you think you are. And so our minds are these things that operate by way of what we think about ourselves, and out of that come a whole lot of habits. We call them attitudes, and out of that comes a whole lot of memories, and out of those memories comes the programming that causes us to behave in certain ways. The way that the mind operates is like this. It operates from back to front. It starts with perception. That is, picking up the stimuli that come to us through our senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, and bodily sensations. From that comes cognition, that is, understanding what we're experiencing. Thirdly comes evaluation, which is to attach value to the thing that we're understanding. And out of that comes decisions, and from decisions comes behavior or action. Now, the thing about, if it was that simple, then all that we really need is a good education, and we would be the best behaved beings on the planet. Unfortunately, in between cognition and decision comes a process, or comes another function of the brain that includes those attitudes, those beliefs, those values, those memories, and it is contained in a thing that has been called or named by certain neuroscientists the limbic or the lizard brain. This is not the webinar in which I want to go into detail about that. Enough for us to understand that the lizard brain is called that because it has no space for rational thought. All it has is space for, that is, the lizard has no space for rational thought or for a prefrontal cortex. All it does is it reacts. It reacts emotionally. It reacts in terms of instinct to things that it sees as either endangering it or inviting it. And so the lizard brain is responsible for what we call the 6 F's. And I'm going to give those to you. Ready to do any one of these at a second's notice. To fight, to flee, to feed, to fear, to freeze, or to fornicate. It brings about all of these reactions in a split second, and then we go from that reaction to the consequences, which then we have no control over, unless something else has happened, unless we have stopped the process, stopped the clock, counted to 10, and allowed ourselves to rationally think about what we're just about to do. The problem is that the limbic brain reacts, in some cases it has been identified to react 15 seconds before the thought occurs. And so we are very often, especially when we're young and when we don't have a sense of responsibility, and when we perhaps haven't got enough of the putting in of good values into our lives, we will very often react long before we have thought about it sufficiently. The thing about all of those reactions, as I said earlier, is that all of them have formed memories, memory responses in our minds. They have created imprints in our brain. And those things in turn become what we call neural pathways. That is, there is a stimulus, there is a kind of an automatic line of response, and then there is an outcome. Those things that we call neural pathways become dominant in our lives if we are not careful, if we don't catch ourselves out responding to them. So now, two parts of a grapefruit, and those two parts of the grapefruit are coming to find each other. Each of them has different imprints over different aspects of their lives. They will see the same thing and have two different responses to that same thing. And so the interruptions of our rational thought that come about through the limbic brain, we can push pause. And the way we push pause is that we engage in planting the seeds of mindfulness. That is to say, to stop and think, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling that? As this conversation is happening, as this event is happening, as this thing that my spouse is doing is causing this set of feelings to come up in me, why am I feeling those feelings? And what can I do about it? How can I take charge rather than just react? So the adult human being is responsible to respond rather than to react. So we are better than lizards. We do have a prefrontal cortex. We do have a brain, and we can take charge within the context of that. So we can move on into understanding the brain not only from a chemical point of view, but also from a digital frame of reference. So the brain is not only this pond of that contains a whole lot of hormones. It is also a processing center, a processing system for the entire body. And so the model of a computer is a good one for understanding this. A computer, as people that are in the room will know better than I, is something that contains a memory. It contains programs, it contains algorithms, it contains all kinds of information that causes it to respond in the same way to certain things every time. And if the input has been erroneous, the output is also going to be erroneous. And so as the process, reminding ourselves of how the brain functions, as the process goes, it looks for information before it responds in this thing we call a database, a center, a memory, a bank. And not only is there one memory bank, but there are layers and layers and layers of memories that will influence what value we attach to things, will influence what decisions we make about those things, and therefore influence the outcomes over and over again, unless we catch ourselves out. And so we need to sow seeds of understanding, of self-awareness, in order to overcome some of those things. The question for all of us need to be asking is, in this moment, in this interaction with my spouse, what story am I living in? Am I living in the story that comes from my past, or the story of the person I want to become? The story of that which has dominated my fears, my feelings, etc. for many years, or the freedom to choose a new path, a new story going into the future. And so we can sow the seeds of the life that wants to be lived through us, rather than the life that has been kind of unconsciously affecting us through our whole lives. And so what does this involve? It involves taking time on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and together with your spouse to visualize the story that you would like to live out, to visualize yourself and to visualize your marriage according to the person you want to become, the way you want to behave, the life you want to live. The other thing that it uses is affirmation. You see, every input into that computer, and there have been a whole lot of negative ones, needs to be overwhelmed with new ones, with positive ones, so that we are no longer dominated by statements that say you're useless, you're no good, you can't do anything, you're just like your father, you're just like your mother, whatever it is. Or you can choose a brand new way. And spouses are responsible for encouraging that in one another. And so my role over against Lorraine is to affirm her, and to, by doing that, to be a part of the way in which her self-perception and her faith, her confidence is encouraged by affirmation rather than by being dominated and being dragged down by so many negative things that might have occurred in her story thus far. So visualization and affirmation are the mechanisms, the seeds by which we can change. So I want to finish with a story that is probably familiar to some of you, which is the story of what is contained within the entire human being and within our minds and our souls, so to speak. And the answer to that question is that a man called Eric Berne defined three what he called ego states, which are ways of being that coexist within every one of us. And those three ego states are, first of all, the parent person. So there is a parent, and that parent is made up of a composite picture of all the authority figures, actual parents, grandparents, teachers, authority figures of all kinds that had emotional significance and impact on the child, especially in his or her first 6 years of life. Their point or their purpose was to control and also to care, to nurture and to instill rules for behaving. Everything from table manners to whether you should go out of the driveway and cross the road, to how you should dress for various occasions, etc. Those rules, ultimately, the rules for everything, we could call them, become what is called the conscience. And many of them are good, and many of them are relevant for your entire life. Others of them are only relevant for that period of time in which you were taught them. So if you continue to be a person dominated by the rule, don't leave the house, you develop a phobia called agoraphobia. And so every good rule can become a bad thing called an obsessive compulsive disorder. Parents operate on the basis of the rules are what I say they are. And if you ask me why, I'll tell you, because I said so, that's why. So that is the parent person in each of us. It seeks to nurture, but with a purpose of control. The second ego state within us is the child. And the child is a learned response to the parent that has developed within the mind and heart of the child. And so from the reactions of parents, the child to whatever the child does, the child learns, I better be careful, I better obey, I better do this, I better do that. And also finding ways to get around some of those rules. And that is called manipulation. The other good side, the good side of the child, is that the child is playful, the child is trusting, the child is imaginative. And so it is a very necessary part of our ego mechanism with which we are able to do many things in life, including enjoying play. And in fact, this is an important part of our ability to have things like romance in our lives. The child in us is driven by needs and desires. It is reactionary and it has no language for those feelings. It just simply reacts. So it is very closely associated in some senses with the limbic or the lizard brain. The third ego state in us, in every one of us, is the adult. And the adult is the rational, the reasoned, rational, coherent, responsible part of you. It is that part which has grown up. It has taken responsibility. It has looked at facts and it has said, how does this fact speak to this fear? And how can I overcome that? It deals with the lies that we have sometimes believed about ourselves that might have been said unthinkingly or in some cases abusively by parents. And it addresses those. It helps us to change the program in the computer to go back to that model. The adult is responsible for his or her own thoughts, feelings, etc., and is honest and transparent. The adult is what we call a WYSIWYG, which means what you see is what you get. It's the part of us that says, I don't need to pretend, I don't need to put on a show, I don't need to manipulate my way through this thing. I can simply say, this is what I think, this is what I believe, this is how I would like us to address this. But at the same time, without the need for my way or the highway, but rather with the ability to sit down, walk side by side with the other and say, let us reason together, so to speak. It has a real desire to know itself. The adult within us wants to grow up by becoming familiar with itself and its own responses and responsibilities. It wants to know self, truth, and it also wants to know this other person with whom I am sharing life. So, moving on quickly to a conclusion. The way that all of this affects our motivations is in the following ways. The parent is the conditioned part of us, and that conditioned aspect operates through the motivational wall of life, through rules, ought-tos, and how-tos. And the outcome, or the intended outcome for the parent, is control. I want to control other people. I want to control my environment. The child, on the other hand, the learned part of us, operates, as I've said before, through lies, or is dominated by lies, by fears, and then therefore to seek to avoid confrontation with all of those things that it fears and all of those unacceptable, those unpalatable lies that it has told itself. And the way that it deals with those is through manipulation. The reasoned part of us, the adult, operates with responsibility, honesty, transparency, and curiosity. It wants to find out more. It wants to learn. The adult also takes responsibility to update old rules and to make sure that they are current to the present reality. Second of all, it undoes the lies so that we can step out of the bubbles, of the boxes that hold us captive. And so the result of that is that through responsibility, honesty, transparency, and curiosity, we become a WYSIWYG, a person who says what you see is what you get. In conclusion, with this entire picture, how does the parent relate to the other parent? If I'm operating out of my parent and the other person is also in their parent, what we have is an argument that never ends, because you have a clash of experts, each of whom believes that their rule is the right one. If you have a child interacting with the other child in the room, what you have seeking to out-manipulate one another through spitefulness, vengefulness, threats, and the instilling of fear. If you have a parent seeking to put their rules on the child, they hook the child in the other person. What that person operates by intimidation. That's how they maintain control. And the child's only response to that is manipulation. And so there are marriages that have become victims of one of these three modes of being. Parents who, the parent mode that hooks the parent mode in the other, and so people who never stop arguing. Or the child who is operating on the basis of, if you don't play the game by my rules, I'm going to take my ball and go home. Or spitefulness, vengefulness, and manipulation of one another. The one that I think is one of the major epidemics that is going on within marriages and intergender relationships today is one of people being in a parent mode, seeking to dominate the child in the other, to have the other person held in an inferior position. It's talk down, it's manipulate up, it's intimidation and manipulation. And of course, intimidation is in many cases, in fact in all cases, it is driven home by the abuse of power and many forms that abuse may take. And so what is the answer? Honesty and transparency. Let me just say it like this. Only two adult people can ever achieve true intimacy, because only two people who regard one another as equal adults are able to be honest, to have transparency, to be vulnerable with one another, to be the WYSIWYG toward the other. And that is the key to what we call intimacy. And so we come to the final seed that needs to be sown if we are going to accomplish a marriage that will be fulfilling and lasting. It is to sow the seeds of equality and mutual submission. The point of a marriage is not to win, except to win this battle. I want to win the battle of showing the more honor than the other person shows me. Imagine marriages where that was the case, where instead of seeking to dominate and seeking to win and seeking to have my way, I sought to allow the other person more honor than they allow me. Imagine contests like that going on morning, noon, and night in every marriage that you are familiar with. Imagine how that could change the capacity that we have to raise up the best in the other person, to call out the best in the other person. Imagine the level of trust and safety that will create between two people, in which, once again, true intimacy can be found. Right in the beginning, it says that after Adam and Eve had been created, it says the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And I take that to mean not only in the sense of physical nakedness, but in the sense of the nakedness of soul, the capacity to be safe enough to show the other person my true self without manipulation, without the need to cover up, without the need to present a false image of who I am, without the need for manipulating the result. It is when I have that freedom within myself that I'm able to create an environment of that freedom for the other. And so we're ending here. I'm sorry about the time again, but we are coming to the end of our session. And so the final seed, I said the moment ago, the other one was the final seed. This is the final seed. Sow seeds of vulnerability and affirmation, and reap mind renewal and freedom from control. That is the goal of the way that you interact with your partner within your marriage. So, thank you for listening and being with us, and we'll see you again next week.